Kyle for teaching class last week and for volunteering to do that, and appreciate him and his willingness to do that. Just in case you're wondering, I'll be going again on the 23rd. I'll be in Texas, and so I'm sure you're going to get a strong recommendation from Lynn. But and Furman. But the first thing when I called Rhonda when I was gone, I said, did you teach or were you in auditorium? She said, I was in auditorium classes. She said, Kyle did a great job, and I said, well, I didn't expect any less, and so we're blessed to have these young families that are such an encouragement to us and such a vital part of our local work, and we're thankful for them and thankful for him and what he continues to do for us and the growth that we're seeing. James chapter 3, you're looking at the lips of an encourager. We closed out 2 weeks ago in this particular lesson, looking at some of the statements that are made by the wise man, the proverbialist. Most of these would be from the pen and the mind of Solomon. And at the bottom of page 86, you see, pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. But then you find on the top of page 87, fourth line down, anxiety in the heart of man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. A wholesome tongue is the tree of life, but perverseness in it, that is the tongue, perverseness in the tongue breaks the spirit. And the two that I thought of immediately when I first started working on this lesson, I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, Proverbs 18:21, and then Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. And so we see that the writer of Proverbs had a lot to say. By the way, there's a lot more about the tongue in the book of Proverbs. And so it's always been a matter of concern for those who love God and love God's people. But I want us to go over to James chapter 3 and work our way through the first, we'll look through the verse, say 12 verses of this chapter as we look at the lips of an encourager and look at just a few of the words that we find in the text. And as I was doing my research, it was interesting, and I'll just point this out, that you'll see some different, I used the New King James. I used the King James for years and years, switched over to the New King James, and when you read, for example, on page 87, James 3:3-6, you'll see which comes from verse number 5. It says, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. Now, I know, Walter, have you got the King James or New King James? Got King James? Does it say how great a matter there in verse 5?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I was looking at that particular word. And the concept there is a forest, not just a thing, but rather the word there applies or is used in regard to a forest or to fuel. In other words, to start a fire, and of course in those days would be to burn wood. And so that's the word there, the word forest, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments. And then it also in that same verse. You find in verse 5, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. And depending on which one of the Greek transcripts you use, one of them is the word for boast. The other is the word for mega boast. In fact, that's the prefix, that's the very prefix in front of it, MEGA, mega boast. And so we see the tongue boasts great things, and even within that there's even a hint of what we might say there's a hint of arrogance in that boastfulness. And so there's a couple of thoughts there that I want to think about, but I'm just kind of giving you some of the language that's there. But you find in verse number 2, it says, first verse 1 says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment." That's something that has always weighed on me, and I guess maybe strangely enough or not strangely enough, the more that I preach and the more that I teach, the greater I feel that burden. I'm more aware of it because, I'm not a young preacher anymore. Even though in my mind I'm still young, I'm not a young preacher anymore. So what happens? Well, I get calls from young preachers that want advice. I get calls from older preachers that want advice. I get calls or contacts through social media from people that want advice, and generally it's thinking, what does the Bible say about this, or this? And sometimes it's very serious matters. And the first thing that always comes to my mind is James chapter 3 and verse 1. I don't want to be guilty of telling them the wrong thing. The older I get, the more I found out how much I don't know, and so I think a lot about that verse and that principle. The older I get, is to be, I guess subject is the right word, to be subject to a stricter judgment. Then verse 2 says, For we all stumble in many things, but if anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man and able to bridle the whole body." Let's look at that verse just for a moment. The word stumble there is a word that means it's a continual stumble. And what that means is it's not that we're always involved in a sin. The idea of a stumble is what?
Fall.
Yeah. But what you get caught off guard. You stumble. A misstep. I've learned through the years. When I'm in the dark and I think I've reached the bottom step, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stick that foot out there a little bit. Make sure there's not one more. Because, there's a lot of times when I thought I was on the last one and I wasn't. I thought I was on the floor and I wasn't. And you take that last one and it just about jars your teeth out. All right. Well, that's the idea of stumbling, or to, there's a commercial that just cracks me up about the guy that stumbles on the sidewalk in front of his house and he throws all the groceries up in the air and he's looking at the camera as he's going down. That's the concept of stumbling. And the Bible teaches us that we're always going to be in the process of stumbling. All right? In other words, it's not a willful sin. It's not a voluntary sin. It's an involuntary sin. And so what the writer is telling us that we're always going to be overtaken in an involuntary sin. In other words, that's going to be a regular part of being alive, and living the Christian life. Of course, now the counterpart to that is 1 John 1 verse 7. If we walk in the light, as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Christ, His Son, cleanses us from all sin. Well, that word is a continual word, cleanses. So even though while we are walking the Christian life, there's always going to be times when we are stumbling. In other words, that's going to be a regular occurrence for us to stumble. The blood of Christ covers that. So God has the answer for our stumbling. But that's the word here is that there's never going to be a time, it's like, and even if you're walking on flat ground, you can stumble, right? I mean, I've watched world-class athletes trip over the 5-yard line. Isn't that right, Blue? I mean, you see some of the most nimble athletes, and it's like there was a ghost there. They just trip for no reason. So, those things happen. Sometimes we stumble because we let our guard down. In other words, we don't pick our feet up like we should, or we're not watching, where we're going. I nearly did a header in Winfield a couple of weeks ago when I was running. I caught an edge of a sidewalk. It was about that high, and I mean, it was just Well, I hurt my shoulder catching myself to keep from doing a face plant right in the middle of downtown Winfield. And so, if you're not watching where you're going to stumble. You let your guard down. And so there's always going to be occasions for stumbling. It says, if a man who does not stumble in word is a perfect man and able to bridle the whole body. Now, you've heard me say this before many, many times. The Bible does not use the word perfect to describe sinlessness. When you see the word perfect in your New Testament, you need to think of the word complete or mature. Complete or mature. And so a man who is able to not regularly stumble in word is a mature man. He's a complete man. Or he or she is a complete person. And so we're not talking about sinless perfection. And says, and indeed is able to bridle the whole body. Then verse 3 continues that illustration of the bridle. It says, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. It says, look also at ships. They are so large, though they are so large and driven by fierce winds, and they're turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. And we see two pictures here. First of all, that the horse is far more powerful than the rider. We all understand that. Even like when I go feed my horses, I am keenly aware, first of all, of how big they are. Second, how strong they are, and also how dumb they are. I mean, because one can just spin and step on you in a heartbeat. But when you think about riding a horse and you put that bit and that bridle in that horse's mouth, if the horse is broken, you can turn that horse any way you want to turn them. You can turn them left or right, or you can stop them. And so you have this small bit that goes in a horse's mouth that allows the rider to control the horse. Then you have this giant ship. And you see how large it is, and yet the rudder in comparison to the ship is very, very tiny. Very tiny. And yet that tiny rudder can turn the entire ship any which way. And notice it says, any which way the steerman desires. In other words, there's a guider, there's somebody who's in control. In other words, the rudder of the ship is under control. Well, the same thing applies to us as individuals. That as a horse, it can be high-spirited. It can yet be brought under control by a very small thing. And as a ship, think about how powerful is the wind. How powerful is a storm? How powerful is a current? And yet that small rudder is able to overcome those influences. Or take those influences and channel them in a productive way. And so the Bible talks about our tongues in those same terms. That when we can get a hold of this, and control this, then it's gonna affect everything else about the body. And of course, the reason is that it takes so much more to control this than it does any other muscle in your body, because the tongue is a muscle. The problem is that it reveals what's up here in that head or in the heart. And so, but the point is, once we learn to control this, in other words, we've got control over our whole body, and that's what God wants. Again, it doesn't mean that we won't ever stumble or we won't ever make mistakes, but we can control it. Then verse 5, even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. In other words, you can burn hundreds and thousands of acres in a single match. I remember when we lived in Arizona, there was we didn't have forests, at least not where we lived. It was desert, but it was a lot of underbrush and mesquite trees and old dry grasses and whatnot. And And there was a tremendous fire one time on Interstate 15 that went from Phoenix to Flagstaff? I believe it was Interstate 15. Somebody had been driving down the interstate, or actually up the interstate, pitched a cigarette out. That's all it took. They wasn't thinking a thing in the world about it, but they pitched a cigarette out, and it got rolled up under some dry grass, and the wind blew on it, and it kindled a fire, and then pretty soon you've got the highway closed because nobody can see you because it's smoke. And it burned miles and miles of grass before they were able to get up there and get it under control and put it out. How many forest fires are started by somebody that inadvertently left a campfire unattended, or didn't put didn't put it all the way out, thought it was out, but it wasn't out, and just a small spark or a small flame can burn hundreds of thousands of acres. And so the Bible's illustrating for us in a very real way, how much trouble can the tongue is a little member, but how much trouble can it get us in? Ask that school teacher back there how much trouble the tongue can get you in. Of course, I think all of us have probably been there at some point in our lives, that we've allowed our tongues to get us in a world of hurt. And so it doesn't take much to do a lot. So that's why we'll always have to be mindful of it. Then you have in verse number 6, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body, sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire by hell. And that's the real word for hell there, Gehenna. And the course of nature there, the word, it just means our very existence. And so again, look at what can happen. Think about this. What kind of trouble did Herod's tongue get him in when Herodias danced in front of him?
Well, he offered her anything she wanted to a certain point.
That's right. I'll give you whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. Up to half the kingdom. And then when he ran his mouth, what did she say?
I want the head of the fellow.
I want the head of John the Baptist. And the Bible says that he was sorrowful to hear that. But it follows it with this statement. Nevertheless, because of the oath that he made in front of those men, he kept that word. Now, he made a rash statement that cost him very dearly, and cost John the Baptist his life. Think about Jephthah in the Old Testament. Jephthah was fixing to go into battle, and he made the statement. He said, "Lord," and I'm going to paraphrase, but this will be accurate, "if you'll deliver my enemies into my hand today, the first thing that I see when I get home, I'll offer up as a burnt offering." And the Lord delivered his enemies into his hand. And then he went home. And the first thing that he saw was what?
His daughter.
His daughter. His daughter came out to greet him. And all the joy, all the joy of being triumphant in battle was immediately dissipated. Completely evaporated. He said, "My daughter, you have brought me low this day." And he wasn't blaming her. But the Bible says he kept his vow. And he kept his vow to the Lord. What did he do? He let his tongue get him in a world of hurt. And so that's the kind of idea there in chapter 3 and verse 6. Then in verse number 7 and 8. Yes, so we'll stop 7 and 8 in this little section. "For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Now, this seems to be, if we were looking at it just in a kind of a de facto way, we think, well, that's kind of contradictory to what we've just read. It says, because if a man can tame the tongue, the same is a whole man. He's a perfect man, a complete man. Then we turn right around here 3 or 4 verses later, it says, no man can tame the tongue. So what does he mean? What does he mean?
Well, he means that you're talking out of, I call it out of turn, but you're talking about stuff that you shouldn't be at various times. But, you know, like you say, well, I can do such and such. Can you really?
Mm-hmm.
Or stuff like that, you know.
In other words, it's not something that plagues you consistently, but it's something that can get on you in a heartbeat. Think about a lion tamer. You know, or what was the 2 jokers, Siegfried and Roy, in Vegas, that had all the tigers? You know, didn't one of them guys get eat up by one of them tigers? You know, years and years and years and years of being in that cage with those tigers, and you know, and nothing ever happened. In other words, he was in control for a long time. But, and I don't know what the circumstances were, but at some point he let his guard down. And when he let his guard down, I guess them tigers had a bait of getting that whip snapped at him and decided he'd just take matters into his own hands. I think that's what James is talking about, is that we can control our tongues. I mean, we know that we can, because obviously, hopefully we do. But there'll be a time when we let our guard down. We'll let our guard down, and when we do, that tiger's going to jump on us. He's going to get us. And so it's not that we can't tame the tongue in any sense. It's that we can control the tongue, but that tongue is just always waiting. In other words, that opportunity, the devil is always waiting, and in a moment's time, we can lose control. And then again, all the bad things that can happen because of that. And then you have verses 9, 10, 11, and 12 close out this series of thoughts. It says, for with it, talking about our tongue, with it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness or the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter out of the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? So then no spring yields both salt water and fresh. In other words, a spring is what it is. And he says that our tongues need to be like that spring. So it needs to be like a good spring that always brings forth good things. Which again, even in our area, most of us are familiar with this concept that even sometimes our springs can run bad, right? Going a well or a spring, every now and then things can happen. No, temporarily they'll run bad, but as a general rule, it'll be a good spring, or it'll be a good well. You know, there's a little fountain at Natural Bridge, at the real Natural Bridge. They're outside the little cabin or the store, and there's always water bubbling up. I think there may be 2 or 3 of them there in that, and it's pretty good water. But I have been over there when it wasn't that good. In fact, I've been over there when you could smell it before you could drink it, because for some reason temporarily it bubbled a lot of sulfur. It bubbled a lot of sulfur water. That water's not that good. But as a general rule, it bubbles up good water. And so with our tongues, our tongues need to be generally, as we say, generally speaking, they need to be things that bubble forth good things. good words, encouraging words. But obviously, again, we have in the back of our mind that there's always some sulfur, there's always some bad water in there, ready to make its way out. And so we find the admonition there. Now, what I want to do here next is go to page 88. 88. There's going to be 2 or 3 lists here that go through the end of the lesson. We probably won't finish these tonight, but I want to think about a couple things. It says using your words wisely. Using your words wisely. Well, first of all, let me look. Just want to look at one thing in the paragraph above. Discouraged people are like houseplants that need nurturing to survive. When neglected, a plant's leaves begin to wither, turn brown, ignored. People seem to wilt as if their heads lower and their shoulders droop. It says, give a forgotten plant a little water and sunshine, and it has an amazing capacity to revive. I do this all the time, like in my garden or when I'm growing potted plants. You know when it needs water when it starts. When Ginger says dying, but they get a little bit. They start sagging a little bit. Now, what causes that is what's called a lack of turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is the water pressure in a plant that allows that plant's branches to stand out and the leaves to stand out. And turgor pressure is adjusted with water, obviously. And so when the water level drops in the plant, the turgor pressure drops, and that's what causes it to droop. But you water one, and this is what I did a lot at the nursing home. I had tomatoes and cucumbers planted at the nursing home. But sometimes I'd go 3 or 4 or 5 days and not go over there. And man, it was hot. And I'd go, and man, them things just be sagging. Tomatoes, everything just sagging. Well, I'd drag a water hose out before I teach Bible class or before I visit them, say on Monday morning, and I'd just give every one of them a good soaking. Just give them all a good soaking. Go put the thing up, go start making my rounds, and I'd come out in an hour. In an hour. Those plants look like they were brand new. Just like brand new. And what Brother Johnson is saying here is that a word of encouragement is just like that good water. That when somebody starts sagging a little bit, all they may need is just a little dose of encouragement. Again, how far can a word of encouragement go? Now, looking at the section on page 88 on using our words wisely, it says to think carefully. Again, we can go back to James. Let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak. Swift to hear and slow to speak. And the second liner, it says, think twice before speaking. Think twice before speaking. There's an old adage about if you're going to build something, you measure what? That's right, Dwayne. You measure twice and cut once. All right? So think twice before you speak once. And because we all understand measure twice, cut once. Because if you don't, you're going to cut twice and it's going to get expensive. Especially if you cut short. And so think twice before speaking once. Down about a little over halfway down, you see the word millions. This has been interesting to me. Millions of people unwittingly devastate their friends and family members on a daily basis. And then the last line in that paragraph says, before we speak, consider how they might hear it, not just how it's intended. In other words, people try to say things that are encouraging, but when they say them, they can be discouraging. Mom has shared a few things that have been said to her in the last month or so that were meant to be encouraging, but they weren't very encouraging at all. In other words, people said things and they meant well, but in other words, they didn't think about how it might be received. And so, and by the way, that's always been trouble with me, because I want people to feel good. So I think I need to, always just, if somebody tells me something, I have an urge to say something, because I want people to feel better. But sometimes, in your hurry to say something, I can say the wrong thing, or it doesn't come across. It doesn't come across. Again, it's not received the way it's intended, and so. I would be better off to think twice about what I'm going to say before I speak once. Even though I say what I do with the very best, I would never want to hurt anybody. But sometimes what we say, it can be hurtful. So consider how things are going to be heard, not just how they are intended. Compliment credibly. Compliment credibly. In other words, if we're going to say something nice about somebody, we want to make sure, first of all, that we mean it, and number two, that it's true. And I've got an example on that one and the next one, but I'm going to hold off on those until the next Wednesday. I wrote one down.
Put that statement in there: Confederate currency, value is Confederate. You get